Music. In the dense, primeval forests of Northern California, where ancient redwoods stand as silent sentinels and mist clings to the mountain slopes like ghostly fingers, there exists a thin boundary between the known world and wilderness untamed. It was here, nestled amongst these towering giants, that Daniel Mercer built his solitary retreat, a rustic cabin that would become the site of one of the most compelling and chilling encounters in modern cryptozoological history. Daniel, a software engineer in his mid-40s, had grown weary of Silicon Valley's relentless pace. After 2 decades of coding in fluorescent-lit offices, he had amassed enough wealth to purchase 20 acres of remote woodland in Humboldt County. The property, accessible only by a winding dirt road that became treacherous in the winter months, offered exactly what Daniel craved: isolation, tranquility, and a chance to disconnect from the digital world that had consumed his life. "I just wanted somewhere to hear myself think," Daniel would later explain, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had glimpsed something beyond ordinary understanding. Somewhere the notification pings couldn't reach me. The cabin itself was modest yet sturdy, a testament to practical design rather than luxury. Constructed primarily of local timber with a metal roof that sang during rainstorms, it featured 2 bedrooms, a spacious living area dominated by a stone fireplace, and a wraparound porch that offered commanding views of the surrounding forest. Solar panels provided limited electricity, while a propane tank powered the kitchen appliances and water heater. It was rustic living by modern standards, but far from primitive. What set Daniel's retreat apart, however, was the sophisticated security system he had installed, a curious contradiction to his stated desire for digital detachment. 8 high-definition cameras positioned strategically around the cabin's perimeter fed into a central server equipped with motion detection software. The system, Daniel insisted, was merely precautionary, a way to monitor wildlife and ensure his property remained undisturbed during his frequent absences. "I told myself it was for peace of mind," Daniel would later confess. "But looking back, I wonder if some part of me already sensed something wasn't right about those woods." The events that would eventually thrust Daniel's private sanctuary into the spotlight began innocuously in late October 2022. Daniel had arrived at the cabin for an extended stay, planning to spend the quiet winter months writing a memoir about his journey through the tech industry. The first few days passed uneventfully as he settled into a comfortable routine: morning hikes along the property's boundaries, afternoons spent writing by the fireplace, evenings stargazing from the porch with a glass of bourbon in hand. It was on the 4th night that the first anomaly appeared on his security feed. At precisely 2:17 a.m., the northwest camera captured a subtle movement at the forest's edge, something large displacing the undergrowth before quickly retreating into the darkness. The motion detection software, programmed to ignore small animals and swaying branches, flagged the incident and saved the footage. Daniel, reviewing the logs over morning coffee, initially dismissed it as a deer or perhaps a black bear, common enough in these parts. But there was something about the movement that nagged at him, a deliberateness that seemed oddly calculated for woodland wildlife. He replayed the footage several times, enhancing and analyzing specific frames, but the dense foliage and poor lighting rendered detailed identification impossible. Mildly unsettled but unwilling to indulge in speculation, Daniel made a note in his journal and continued with his day. 3 nights later, the disturbances escalated. A series of sounds, heavy footfalls on the forest floor, the snap of substantial branches, and most disturbingly, what seemed like low, guttural vocalizations, woke Daniel from a sound sleep. Disoriented and alarmed, he grabbed his flashlight and smartphone, accessing the security system remotely as he cautiously approached the bedroom window. The live feed showed nothing unusual, but the audio sensors had captured the sounds clearly enough. Daniel stood frozen, listening intently as the noises continued for nearly 7 minutes before fading into the distance. Whatever had made those sounds was moving away from the cabin, retreating deeper into the forest. Sleep eluded Daniel for the remainder of the night. As first light penetrated the tree canopy, he ventured outside to investigate, his boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. What he discovered sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the morning air. Approximately 50 yards from the cabin's northern wall, he found tracks, large, distinctly humanoid impressions pressed deep into the soft earth. Measuring over 16 inches in length and showing clear evidence of 5 toes, the footprints belonged to no animal Daniel could readily identify. More disturbing still was the pattern. These were bipedal tracks left by something that walked upright on 2 legs. "I've been hiking my whole life," Daniel would later tell investigators, his voice steady despite the extraordinary nature of his claim. "I know what bear tracks look like. I know what human tracks look like. These were neither and both at the same time." With methodical precision born from his technical background, Daniel documented the discovery. He photographed each distinct track, placed a measuring tape beside them for scale, and even created rudimentary plaster casts using materials from an emergency repair kit stored in his shed. The analytical part of his mind, the engineer who had spent decades solving complex problems, sought rational explanations. Perhaps this was an elaborate prank, staged by locals who resented the influx of wealthy tech workers buying up remote properties. Or maybe it was a bear that had left unusually clear prints while standing momentarily on its hind legs. Yet deep down, in the primitive part of his consciousness that modern life had failed to fully suppress, Daniel knew he was witnessing something that defied conventional explanation. Tales of the elusive Sasquatch, the legendary hominid said to roam the Pacific Northwest's remote forests, flickered through his mind. Stories he had previously dismissed as folklore or misidentifications suddenly seemed less implausible in the face of the evidence before him. Over the next several days, a tense quiet descended on the property. The security cameras captured no unusual activity, and the nightly disturbances ceased. Daniel, though still uneasy, began to wonder if whatever had visited his property had moved on, perhaps continuing along some ancient migratory route disturbed by human development. He even found himself able to joke about the incident during his weekly video call with his sister in San Francisco. "Either I've got Bigfoot for a neighbor, or someone around here has enormous feet and a strange sense of humor," he quipped, not knowing how prophetic his words would prove. On November 7th, nearly 2 weeks after the initial incident, Daniel awoke to find his firewood stack disarranged. The neatly piled cords he had stacked along the eastern side of the cabin now lay scattered across the clearing, as if something had rummaged through them, searching for something. Stranger still, his axe, a premium splitting maul he had left embedded in a chopping block, was missing. The security cameras had captured the incident, though the footage raised more questions than it answered. At 3:42 a.m., a large, shadowy figure had moved into frame, approaching the woodpile with surprising stealth for its considerable size. The motion-activated floodlights had triggered, but the figure appeared unperturbed by the sudden illumination. The recording showed the unmistakable silhouette of something massive and bipedal methodically dismantling the woodpile, pausing occasionally, as if to examine individual logs before discarding them. After approximately 4 minutes, it extracted the axe from the chopping block with apparent ease, tested its weight with a gentle swing that displayed alarming dexterity, and then retreated into the forest, the tool clutched in what appeared to be a massive, hair-covered hand. "I've worked with computer vision and digital imagery for most of my career," Daniel later explained to the small group of researchers who would eventually review his evidence. I know how lighting and camera angles can distort perception. I know about pareidolia, the human tendency to see familiar patterns like faces or human forms in random stimuli. But what my cameras captured that night wasn't an illusion or a misinterpretation. It was something tangible, something real, something that took my damn axe. The incident with the woodpile and the stolen axe marked a turning point in Daniel's experience. No longer content to merely document and speculate, he became determined to understand what was happening on his property. He reached out discreetly to several wildlife experts and anthropologists, careful to present his inquiry as a hypothetical situation rather than a personal experience. The responses varied from polite dismissal to recommendations for trail camera deployment, but none offered satisfactory explanations for what he had witnessed. Meanwhile, the nocturnal visitor continued its sporadic appearances. The security cameras captured brief glimpses, a shadow moving between trees, a large form briefly illuminated by moonlight, distant vocalizations that raised the hair on Daniel's arms. It seemed to be growing increasingly comfortable with its surveillance of the cabin, venturing closer each night, testing boundaries with careful deliberation. It was studying me, Daniel would later realize. While I was trying to understand it, it was learning about me, my habits, my vulnerabilities, the layout of my home. We were engaged in mutual observation, a strange dance of curiosity and caution. By late November, winter had tightened its grip on the mountains. Heavy rains gave way to the first snowfall, transforming the landscape into a monochromatic wonderland. Daniel, though still unsettled by his mysterious visitor, found himself captivated by the stark beauty of his snow-covered property. He spent hours photographing ice formations on tree branches and animal tracks preserved in the crystalline powder, temporarily distracted from the growing tension. The snow brought an unexpected advantage. Any approach to the cabin now left clear, unmistakable evidence. Daniel began each morning with a perimeter check, noting with increasing unease the large bipedal tracks that occasionally circled his dwelling. Sometimes they approached right up to the windows, suggesting that while he slept, something enormous stood just inches away, peering into his home. On November 30th, Daniel made a discovery that shattered any remaining skepticism about the nature of his visitor. While clearing snow from the porch steps, his gaze fell upon a distinctive shape pressed into a snowdrift beside the cabin, a clear impression where something had sat, observing the structure. The imprint showed what appeared to be buttocks, powerful thighs, and most tellingly, a series of 5 finger-like depressions where a hand had rested in the snow. It sat there, Daniel whispered to himself, a chill running through him that had nothing to do with the winter air. It sat there like a person would, watching my cabin, probably watching me through the windows. With trembling hands, he photographed and measured the impression. The estimated height of whatever had left the imprint exceeded 7 feet, far larger than any human Daniel had ever encountered. The proportions, while humanoid, suggested a frame of enormous power, with a barrel chest and limbs of significant musculature. That night, Daniel found himself unable to sleep, his mind racing with implications. If the creature he'd been documenting was indeed what folklore called Sasquatch or Bigfoot, he possessed evidence of historical significance. Yet alongside this realization came a growing concern. The creature's behavior suggested a pattern of escalating boldness. What had begun as distant observation had progressed to closer examination, and now to direct interaction with his property. What might be the next step in this progression? Daniel's concern proved prescient. At precisely 1:14 a.m. on December 1st, a tremendous crash jolted him from his uneasy slumber. The security system's alarm blared through the cabin as multiple motion sensors triggered simultaneously. Heart pounding, Daniel grabbed his smartphone and accessed the live feed, his breath catching in his throat at what he saw. The back door, reinforced oak that Daniel had specifically chosen for its durability, hung from a single hinge, splintered near the lock as if struck by enormous force. And through this damaged entry point came a creature that defied everything Daniel understood about the natural world. Standing fully erect at what had to be over 8 feet tall, its broad shoulders nearly filling the doorframe, was a massive, hair-covered hominid. The security lighting illuminated a powerful body covered in thick, dark fur, a sloped forehead above deep-set eyes that reflected the light with an amber glow, and massive hands with opposable thumbs and dexterous fingers. The missing axe was clutched in its right hand, held with the casual comfort of a tool user. Daniel, frozen in terror and awe, watched through his phone as the creature ducked its head to clear the damaged doorframe and stepped deliberately into his kitchen. Its movements were neither rushed nor clumsy, but displayed the confident precision of an apex predator. It paused, nostrils flaring as it scented the air, then turned its massive head directly toward the bedroom where Daniel lay, paralyzed with fear. For one eternal moment, Daniel felt certain that the creature somehow knew exactly where he was, that, despite the walls between them, it sensed his presence as surely as if he stood before it. A low, rumbling vocalization emanated from its barrel chest, vibrating through the cabin with palpable force. Then, with surprising deliberateness, it turned away from the bedroom door and began a methodical exploration of the kitchen. Large hands opened cupboards, examined contents, and occasionally pocketed small items. It studied the refrigerator with evident curiosity before working out the mechanism and swinging the door open, bathing itself in cold light. It wasn't mindless ransacking, Daniel would later explain, his voice tinged with reluctant admiration. There was intelligence behind its actions. It was selectively choosing certain items, examining others with genuine curiosity. When it opened a package of beef jerky, it didn't tear into it like an animal. It carefully unwrapped it, sampled a piece, and then took the rest. That level of dexterity, of cognitive ability, it was humbling and terrifying in equal measure. For nearly 20 minutes, Daniel remained motionless in his bedroom, documenting the creature's systematic raid through his remotely accessed security system. It moved from the kitchen to the living area, examining books, electronic devices, and furniture with what appeared to be genuine interest. At one point, it spent several minutes turning the pages of a photography book, large fingers surprisingly delicate as they manipulated the glossy paper. As the creature continued its exploration, Daniel faced an agonizing decision. The bedroom, indoor, solid wood but with a simple privacy lock, would provide little barrier if the intruder decided to investigate further. His truck keys lay on the nightstand, offering the possibility of escape, but reaching his vehicle would require passing directly through the living area where the creature now stood. In the end, survival instinct won out over scientific curiosity. With meticulous care, Daniel silently clothed himself in warm layers, pulled on his snow boots, and collected his essential valuables, wallet, phone, and car keys. The cabin's design included a small window in the master bathroom, originally installed for ventilation. It would be a tight squeeze, but it offered the only exit that wouldn't bring him face to face with the intruder. As Daniel levered himself through the narrow opening, the frigid night air bit at his exposed skin. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he dropped to the ground, and he froze, certain the sound would alert the creature to his escape. Seconds stretched into eternity as he waited, pressed against the cabin wall, barely breathing. When no massive form appeared around the corner, Daniel began a crouching run toward where his truck sat parked, approximately 40 yards from the cabin. The snow-covered ground made progress difficult, each step requiring careful placement to minimize noise. Halfway to the vehicle, a distinctive sound from behind stopped him cold, the squeal of the cabin's damaged back door being pushed further open. Daniel turned slowly, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air, to see the massive silhouette of the creature framed in the doorway. It stood utterly still, steam rising from its fur in the cold, amber eyes fixed directly on his position. Even at this distance, Daniel could feel the weight of its gaze, intelligent, calculating, and utterly alien. For one suspended moment, human and hominid regarded each other across the snowy clearing, two intelligent species from different worlds, suddenly thrust into contact. Then, with deliberate slowness, the creature raised its right arm, the one still holding Daniel's axe, and extended it outward. The gesture's meaning was unmistakable in its clarity. A warning, a claim of territory, a demonstration of power. This was no longer observation or curiosity. It was assertion. Daniel understood with crystal clarity that he was being allowed to leave, this time. The message couldn't have been clearer if it had been spoken aloud. The cabin no longer belonged to him. With slow, backward steps, never taking his eyes off the massive figure, Daniel retreated toward his truck. The creature remained in the doorway, watching impassively as he fumbled with frozen fingers to unlock the vehicle, climbed inside, and started the engine. As headlights illuminated the scene, the creature finally moved, stepping fully outside, and drawing itself to its full, imposing height. In that moment, bathed in artificial light against the backdrop of the forest primeval, it presented an image of primordial power, a creature of legend, momentarily exposed to modern documentation before reclaiming its place in the shadows of human consciousness. Daniel navigated the treacherous mountain road in a state of numb disbelief, the events of the night replaying in his mind as he descended towards civilization. By dawn, he had reached the small town of Willow Creek, where he sat in a diner parking lot, making frantic phone calls. First, to local authorities to report a break-in, carefully omitting descriptions of the intruder, and then to a college friend who had pursued anthropology rather than technology. "Something impossible just happened," he told her, his voice barely above a whisper, "and I have it all on video." As morning light illuminated the mist-shrouded mountains behind him, Daniel Mercer found himself at a crossroads, one that would not only determine his future, but potentially rewrite our understanding of what truly dwells in the continent's remaining wilderness. The evidence stored on his phone and in the cabin's server represented either the most significant cryptozoological discovery of the century or the beginning of a profound delusion. Either way, there was no returning to the life he had known before. The boundary between known and unknown had been irreparably breached, leaving him stranded in the ambiguous territory between empirical reality and the world of legend. And somewhere in the ancient forest, a creature of myth had claimed a new territory, its actions suggesting a level of intelligence and purpose that would force humanity to reconsider its place in the natural order. If only the world would believe what Daniel's cameras had captured. The events that transpired at that remote cabin would soon ripple outward, drawing others into their wake, scientists, skeptics, believers, and opportunists. But as Daniel sat in his truck that December morning, exhausted and overwhelmed, one thought predominated: the creature had known exactly what it was doing. From first observation to final confrontation, it had executed what appeared to be a deliberate, calculated plan. This was no random animal encounter. It was first contact of an entirely unexpected kind, and it had been recorded in its entirety. The small town of Willow Creek, often called the Bigfoot capital of the world, had weathered decades of alleged sightings, footprint casts, and blurry photographs. Its economy had adapted to embrace this cryptozoological identity. Gift shops sold Sasquatch memorabilia, the local museum displayed purported evidence, and annual festivals celebrated the elusive forest giant. Yet beneath the commercialized folklore ran a current of genuine belief, particularly among long-time residents who spoke in hushed tones about family members' encounters dating back generations. It was into this complex cultural landscape that Daniel Mercer stumbled, shell-shocked and sleep-deprived, on that December morning. The Bigfoot diner, where he had parked his truck, seemed an ironic sanctuary given his experience, its entrance flanked by a grinning wooden carving of the very creature he had fled. Dr. Elaine Tanner, Daniel's college friend and the recipient of his frantic pre-dawn call, arrived shortly after noon. A tenured anthropology professor specializing in primate evolution, she had driven 3 hours from her university upon hearing the edge in Daniel's voice, a tension she recognized as genuine fear rather than excitement or confusion. "You look like you've seen a ghost," were her first words as she slid into the booth across from him, studying his haggard appearance with professional detachment. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, his hands trembled slightly around a coffee mug, and he flinched at sudden sounds from the kitchen. "Not a ghost," Daniel replied, voice barely above a whisper. "Something far more substantial." He slid his smartphone across the table, opened to a still frame from his security footage. The image, though somewhat grainy due to low light conditions, clearly showed a massive figure standing in his kitchen, its proportions unmistakably outside human norms. Elaine's academic skepticism warred visibly with the evidence before her. Unlike the typical blurry blob-squatch photos that crossed her desk with depressing regularity, this image contained reference points, door frames, countertops, appliances that provided undeniable scale. Whatever stood in Daniel's kitchen was enormous. "You haven't shared this with anyone else?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. Daniel shook his head. "Just the local sheriff's department, and I only reported a break-in. Didn't mention what did it." "Smart," Elaine nodded. "We need to approach this methodically." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Daniel, if this is genuine, and I'm not saying it isn't, it would represent the most significant cryptozoological discovery in history. But the scrutiny will be intense. Your life, your mental health, your very credibility will be dissected by everyone from academic institutions to tabloid journalists." Daniel ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "I'm not looking for fame. Elaine, I just want to understand what happened, what's still happening at my property." "Your property?" Elaine raised an eyebrow. "You're not planning to go back there?" "It's my home," Daniel said simply. "Besides, all the primary evidence is there. The security server with the complete footage, the physical evidence around the cabin. I can't just abandon it." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Deputy Marcus Whitehorse, the officer who had taken Daniel's break-in report earlier that morning. Tall and broad-shouldered with the weathered features of someone who spent considerable time outdoors, Whitehorse carried himself with the quiet authority of a third-generation law enforcement officer. "Mr. Mercer," he nodded, sliding into the booth beside Elaine. "Got your message about meeting here. Mind if I ask why you didn't want me coming to your cabin directly?" Daniel hesitated, exchanging glances with Elaine. Deputy Whitehorse noticed the interaction and sighed, his expression suggesting he'd seen this dance before. "Look," Whitehorse said quietly, "let's cut through it. This is Willow Creek. When someone with a remote property reports a break-in but doesn't want officers visiting the scene, there's usually one of 3 explanations: illegal marijuana cultivation, domestic dispute they're not disclosing, or," he paused meaningfully, "something they saw in the woods that they don't think we'll believe." The directness caught Daniel off guard. "The third one," he admitted. Whitehorse's expression remained professionally neutral. "I figured as much. My grandfather was Yurok. He had stories about the wild people that went back before European contact. I'm not saying I believe or disbelieve, but I probably have a more open mind than you'd expect from someone wearing this badge. Something in the deputy's manner, a sincerity that transcended professional courtesy, prompted Daniel to unlock his phone again and slide it across the table. Whitehorse studied the image without visible reaction, then swiped through several more stills that Daniel had extracted from the footage. "You have video?" he asked finally. "Nearly 20 minutes. Of it," Daniel confirmed, "plus weeks of preliminary encounters leading up to the break-in. It wasn't random. This thing, whatever it is, was observing me, learning my routines, testing boundaries." Whitehorse returned the phone and sat back, expression thoughtful. "I've been on the force here for 17 years. In that time, I've taken 23. Official reports involving alleged Sasquatch sightings. Most were tourists who mistook bears or shadows. A few were locals who genuinely believed what they saw. None had evidence this compelling." "What happens now?" Elaine asked. "Officially, I mean." "Officially, I investigate a breaking and entering at Mr. Mercer's property. I document damaged doors, missing items, and any evidence of the perpetrator." He fixed Daniel with a steady gaze. "Unofficially, I'm going to recommend you approach this situation with extreme caution. Whatever broke into your cabin demonstrated intelligence, strength, and territorial behavior. 3 characteristics that demand respect in any species." As their conversation continued, strategies began to form. Deputy Whitehorse would accompany Daniel and Elaine back to the cabin for an official investigation, providing both legitimate documentation and an armed escort. Elaine, leveraging her academic credentials, would begin the process of preserving and authenticating the evidence from a scientific perspective. By mid-afternoon, the unusual trio was navigating the treacherous mountain road leading to Daniel's property. Fresh snowfall had partially obscured the tire tracks from Daniel's hasty departure, and the forest seemed unnaturally quiet, the usual bird calls and wildlife movements conspicuously absent. As they rounded the final bend, the cabin came into view, its damaged back door immediately visible. More alarmingly, the front door now stood completely open, swaying slightly in the mountain breeze. "I definitely closed and locked that when I left," Daniel said, a tremor in his voice. Deputy Whitehorse drew his service weapon, signaling for Daniel and Elaine to remain in the vehicle while he conducted an initial sweep of the premises. They watched anxiously as he approached the cabin with practiced caution, disappearing inside for several tense minutes before emerging on the front porch and waving them forward. "It's clear," he called, "but you need to see this." The interior of the cabin told a story of methodical exploration rather than mindless vandalism. Cabinet doors stood open, their contents selectively disturbed. Books had been removed from shelves, some lying open as if examined. Most tellingly, food items had been systematically sorted. Packages of dried fruit, nuts, and jerky were missing, while canned goods and processed foods remained untouched. "It came back," Daniel whispered, surveying the scene. "After I left, it came back and took its time." "It was looking for specific things," Elaine observed, her academic detachment momentarily overtaken by wonder. Food items it had already identified as desirable. "This isn't random foraging. This is targeted acquisition." Deputy Whitehorse was examining the damaged back door, running his fingers along the splintered wood where the lock had been broken. "Single impact point. Whatever did this hit it once with tremendous force, precisely at the weakest point in the frame. That's not accidental." Daniel led them to his office, where the central security server was housed. To his relief, the equipment appeared untouched, the system still running despite a power outage that had caused other electronics to reset. He quickly navigated to the previous night's footage, and the 3 gathered around his monitor to watch the events unfold from multiple camera angles. The footage was breathtaking in its clarity and implications. For nearly 20 minutes, they watched in silence as the massive hominid systematically explored the cabin, its behavior displaying undeniable purpose and intelligence. When it finally departed, the cameras captured it, carrying a makeshift bundle, containing food items and several small objects, including one of Daniel's flashlights and a small mirror from the bathroom. "Tool use," Elaine murmured, her scientific skepticism crumbling in the face of overwhelming evidence. "Complex problem-solving, resource acquisition and transport. This isn't just a wild animal, Daniel. This is, I don't even have a classification, a framework for what we're seeing." Deputy Whitehorse's attention had shifted to the footage from earlier that morning after Daniel's departure. The creature had returned shortly after dawn, entering through the already damaged back door and conducting a more thorough exploration of the premises. Most notably, it spent considerable time in Daniel's office, examining the books, maps, and computer equipment with apparent interest. "It's learning about you," Whitehorse observed. "About humans in general, maybe. Look how it's studying your maps, your books. It's not just taking things it can use, it's gathering information." As they continued reviewing the footage, a pattern emerged that sent chills down Daniel's spine. The creature had made not 2, but 4 separate visits to the cabin since his departure, each time removing small, seemingly random items: a book on local ecology, a compass, a roll of duct tape, batteries. "It's establishing territory," Whitehorse said quietly, "making this place its own. My grandfather would say it's claiming the space, removing the previous owner's presence and replacing it with its own." Elaine had moved to the windows, studying the surrounding forest with new awareness. "The academic community isn't prepared for this, Daniel. The existence of an undiscovered hominid species with this level of intelligence, it would rewrite textbooks across multiple disciplines." "If they believed it," Daniel replied, voicing the concern that had been growing since his escape. "That's why we need to be strategic," Elaine turned back to them. "We need more than just video, compelling as it is. We need physical evidence, DNA samples, rigorous documentation of behaviors. We need to build a case so overwhelming that it can't be dismissed." Deputy Whitehorse had been silent, his law enforcement training prompting him to consider more immediate concerns. "Before we worry about convincing scientists, we need to address safety. Whatever this creature is, it's demonstrated both intelligence and territorial aggression. It's also shown a pattern of escalation, from observation to interaction to occupation." The implications hung heavily in the room. If the creature's behavior continued to escalate, what might be its next move? And if it wasn't alone, if this individual represented a family group or larger population, how might they respond to human encroachment on what they perhaps viewed as ancestral territory? As evening approached, the 3 devised a tentative plan. Daniel would temporarily relocate to Willow Creek, taking a room at the local motel. The security system would remain operational, uploading footage to a cloud server that could be monitored remotely. Deputy Whitehorse would file his report on the break-in, carefully worded to document the facts without speculating on the nature of the intruder. Elaine would reach out to select colleagues, those she trusted to approach the situation with scientific integrity rather than predetermined skepticism. Before departing, Daniel gathered essential belongings and the portable hard drive containing backup copies of all security footage. As he was about to leave his office, a sudden impulse made him reach for a leather-bound journal and pen. Something told him the coming days would bring experiences worth documenting in a more personal, immediate format than digital video. The sun was setting as they locked the cabin and prepared to depart, bathing the forest in golden light that belied the tension of their situation. Daniel paused on the porch, gazing at the tree line where the creature had first emerged from. The shadows, For a moment, he thought he glimpsed movement, a shifting of branches that didn't match the wind's patterns, a momentary displacement of space that suggested something large, moving with deliberate stealth. "It's watching us now, isn't it?" he asked quietly. Deputy Whitehorse followed his gaze, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his holster. "Probably. If it's as intelligent as its behavior suggests, it would certainly monitor our response to its actions." "What do we call it?" Daniel asked suddenly. "In all our planning and analysis, we keep saying it or the creature. But if we're dealing with an intelligent species, that seems inadequate." Elaine considered this. "Scientifically, we should avoid folk names like Bigfoot or Sasquatch until we have proper classification. But for our purposes, for clarity in our discussions, I suppose Sasquatch is as good a term as any." "My grandfather's people called them Uma," Whitehorse offered. "It means the strong one in Yurok. Some of the old stories say they weren't always hidden, that long ago they lived alongside humans, traded with them sometimes. Only when white settlers arrived with their guns and their fear did the Uma retreat deep into the forests. As they drove away from the cabin, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that a significant threshold had been crossed, not just in his own life, but perhaps in human history. If what they had witnessed was indeed an undiscovered hominid species, with advanced cognitive abilities, the implications extended far beyond cryptozoology. It would challenge fundamental assumptions about human uniqueness and our supposed comprehensive knowledge of the natural world. In Willow Creek, Daniel checked into the Redwood Motel, a modest establishment whose wood-paneled walls were adorned with faded photographs of alleged Sasquatch sightings and newspaper clippings about famous encounters. The irony wasn't lost on him. He now possessed evidence that would render this quaint collection of memorabilia profoundly significant rather than merely touristic. That evening, in the motel's small restaurant, Daniel, Elaine, and Deputy Whitehorse gathered to formalize their approach to the unfolding situation. Over plates of simple fare, they spoke in hushed tones, aware that in a town like Willow Creek, walls had ears, and casual conversation could quickly become local legend. "We need to establish parameters," Elaine said, her academic training asserting itself. "What exactly are our goals here? Documentation, contact, protection of the species. Our approach should be guided by clear objectives." Daniel considered this. "I want to understand. That's my primary goal, to comprehend what's happening and why. Is this an isolated individual or part of a larger population? Why reveal itself now, after decades or centuries of successful concealment? What changed?" "Protection has to be a priority," Whitehorse interjected firmly. "Both human safety and the creature's welfare. If news of this gets out prematurely, that mountain will be swarming with everyone from government agents to trophy hunters." The conversation paused as their server, a young woman whose name tag identified her as Jessica, approached with coffee refills. She glanced curiously at the papers spread across their table, which Elaine discreetly covered with a menu. "You folks in town for the Bigfoot conference?" Jessica asked conversationally. "It doesn't start until next month, but we get early arrivals sometimes." "Just doing some property assessment," Daniel replied, the partial truth coming easily. "I have a cabin up near Carson Ridge." Jessica's expression shifted subtly. "Carson Ridge, that's pretty remote territory. Beautiful, though." She hesitated, then continued more quietly. "My uncle used to log up that way in the 90s. He had some stories about that area, things the logging companies didn't put in their official reports. Might be worth asking locals about the history before you get too settled." Before they could probe further, she was called to another table, leaving them with a cryptic comment that hinted at deeper local knowledge than tourist-facing Sasquatch folklore. "That's our next step," Elaine decided once Jessica was out of earshot. "We need local context. Historical sightings, traditional knowledge, patterns of activity. Willow Creek markets itself as the Bigfoot capital, but beneath the commercialization, there's likely genuine indigenous knowledge and first-hand accounts that never made it into official records. Deputy Whitehorse nodded. I know some elders who might be willing to talk provided we approach respectfully, but we need to tread carefully. These aren't just campfire stories to them. They're part of a cultural and spiritual worldview. As they continued planning, Daniel's phone chimed with a notification, motion detected on the cabin's exterior cameras. They huddled around the small screen, watching in real time as a large, shadowy figure moved deliberately across the property, circling the cabin in what appeared to be a patrol pattern. It's establishing a routine, Elaine observed, her voice a mixture of scientific fascination and primal unease. Territorial maintenance behavior. This isn't opportunistic. It's systematic occupation. The creature completed its circuit of the cabin, then paused near where Daniel's truck had been parked. It crouched, examining the ground where tire tracks and footprints remained visible in the snow. With deliberate movements, it placed one massive hand beside a human footprint, Daniel's, as if making a direct comparison. It's studying you, Whitehorse said quietly. Learning your patterns, just as you're trying to learn its. Daniel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December air. It's not just claiming territory, it's investigating me, specifically me. The implications of this observation hung heavily in the air. They weren't merely dealing with an animal defending its range. They were interacting with an intelligent entity capable of targeted interest in specific humans. As midnight approached, Elaine returned to her room to begin drafting research protocols, while Deputy Whitehorse departed for his home with promises to return in the morning. Left alone, Daniel sat by the motel window, gazing out at the small town now quiet under a blanket of stars. His phone chimed again, another alert from the cabin security system. With a sense of both dread and fascination, he opened the notification to find a still image from his office camera. The creature was seated in his desk chair, massive frame dwarfing the furniture designed for human proportions. Before it, on the desk, lay an open book, Daniel's copy of Primates of the World, an illustrated guide. The image was so incongruous, so contrary to every assumption about wild creatures, that Daniel found himself momentarily unable to process its implications. Here was a being long relegated to folklore and fireside tales, demonstrating behavior that suggested not just intelligence, but intellectual curiosity, a desire to learn, to understand, to contextualize its world and perhaps its own existence within human knowledge frameworks. As Daniel stared at the image, a new notification appeared, this time from the camera in his kitchen. The creature had moved, and now stood examining the refrigerator door, where Daniel had pinned several photographs, family snapshots, hiking adventures, a group photo from his company's last retreat. With careful precision, belying its enormous fingers, the creature unpinned one specific image, a photo of Daniel standing beside his cabin shortly after its completion, arms spread in pride and accomplishment. It studied the photograph for several long moments, then did something that sent Daniel's pulse racing. It carried the photo to the window and held it up, comparing the image to the actual cabin, then to the surrounding property visible in the background. "It's making connections," Daniel whispered to the empty room, recognizing representations, understanding that the 2D image corresponds to 3D reality. This wasn't just advanced animal behavior. This was symbolic thought, the cornerstone of human cognitive evolution and the foundation of complex culture. As Daniel watched, unable to tear his eyes from the screen, the creature carefully returned the photograph to the refrigerator door, securing it with the same magnet. Then it turned, looking directly at the kitchen camera with an unwavering gaze that somehow conveyed awareness, not just of the recording device itself, but of the possibility that Daniel might be watching. For several breathless seconds, creature and camera locked in silent acknowledgement across miles of physical distance, but perhaps less cognitive separation than humanity had ever imagined. Then, with deliberate slowness, it raised one massive hand in a gesture that unmistakably mimicked a human wave. Daniel dropped the phone as if it had burned him, his mind reeling with implications. This wasn't just territory defense or resource acquisition. This was communication, intentional, directed, and undeniably intelligible, despite the vast evolutionary gulf between transmitter and receiver. Something unprecedented was unfolding in that remote cabin, something that transcended cryptozoology, biology, anthropology, and perhaps even humanity's understanding of its unique place in the cognitive hierarchy of Earth's species. As Daniel finally succumbed to exhaustion, collapsing fully clothed onto the motel bed, one thought circled relentlessly through his mind. Tomorrow would bring not just the continuation of a personal encounter with an unknown species, but perhaps the beginning of interspecies communication, unlike anything documented in human history. And somewhere in the mountainous forests of Northern California, an entity previously relegated to myth was initiating that contact with purpose and intelligence that demanded recognition of its sentience, a recognition that would soon ripple outward to challenge the foundations of human exceptionalism and our perceived mastery of the natural world. Dawn broke over Willow Creek with an unseasonal clarity, the December sun illuminating the mountains where Daniel's cabin and its unusual occupant waited. After showing Elaine and Deputy Whitehorse the footage of the Sasquatch's apparent communication attempt, a new urgency infused their makeshift research team. "This changes everything," Elaine said, pacing the small motel room. "If it's deliberately attempting communication, we're no longer just documenting a new species. We're potentially establishing first contact with an indigenous, intelligent hominid." Deputy Whitehorse had grown quieter, more contemplative. "My grandfather spoke of the Uma as the people before people. He said they understood more than we credited, but chose isolation after witnessing human violence. Their debate about next steps was interrupted by an unexpected visitor, Jessica, the waitress from the previous evening. She stood nervously in the doorway, clutching a weathered, leather-bound journal. "My uncle's log," she explained, placing it on the table. "I heard you talking last night. If you're experiencing what I think you are on Carson Ridge, you should read this. He wasn't crazy, despite what people said." The journal detailed logging operations from 1996-1998, including multiple encounters with what the writer described as forest people. Most significantly, it documented a pattern of communication, objects left at camp boundaries, mimicry of human activities, and territorial markers that directed human movement away from certain areas without direct confrontation. "They're smarter than us in ways we don't recognize," read one passage. "They know how to live alongside without being seen. They only become visible when we've crossed boundaries they can no longer tolerate." Armed with this new historical context, they formulated their plan. Rather than treating the Sasquatch as merely an object of study, they would approach the situation as a cross-cultural contact requiring diplomatic protocols. Daniel would return to the cabin not to reclaim it, but to establish communication parameters. "We're thinking about this backward," Daniel realized. "It's not breaking into my cabin. It's allowing me into its territory under specific conditions." That afternoon, they drove back to the property with carefully selected items: field guides to local plants and wildlife, simple tools, a set of laminated cards with basic pictograms, and a tablet loaded with visual communication software developed for great ape research. The cabin appeared unchanged since their last visit, but the security footage revealed continued activity. The Sasquatch had maintained its regular patrols and had spent several hours examining Daniel's bookshelves with apparent methodical interest. Deputy Whitehorse positioned himself at a discreet distance with observation equipment, while Daniel and Elaine prepared the cabin's porch as a neutral contact zone. They arranged the communication materials and set out several food items identified from the creature's previous selections, then retreated to Whitehorse's position. As dusk fell, thermal imaging detected movement in the forest, not just one signature, but three distinct heat patterns suggesting multiple large bodies. The primary subject, now designated Alpha, emerged first, approaching the porch with familiar confidence. Two others, smaller but similarly proportioned, remained at the forest edge. A family group, Elaine whispered, her scientific detachment momentarily overcome by wonder. We're witnessing social structure. Alpha examined the arranged items, showing particular interest in the pictograms. In a gesture that left them breathless, it selected cards showing food, shelter, and human, arranging them in a sequence that suggested rudimentary syntax. Over the next 4 hours, they observed behavior that defied conventional understanding of non-human intelligence. Alpha used the tablet's touch interface after minimal observation, engaged with visual matching games originally designed for gorillas with ease, and most remarkably, began creating its own symbolic communications by arranging objects in patterns. It's not learning our communication system, Daniel realized. It's teaching us theirs. Near midnight, Alpha did something unprecedented. It deliberately approached their observation position, stopping 30 yards away. In the moonlight, its massive frame projected not menace but a solemn dignity. It placed a bundle on the ground, Daniel's missing axe, wrapped in tree bark on which geometric patterns had been etched, then retreated to the forest edge. A gift exchange, Whitehorse murmured. A traditional diplomatic protocol in many indigenous cultures. The implications were staggering. They weren't just documenting an undiscovered species. They were witnessing the emergence of a parallel intelligence that had evolved alongside humanity while deliberately avoiding detection. A shadow civilization with its own culture, communication systems, and social structures. In the days that he followed, Daniel made a difficult decision. Rather than exposing this discovery to the wider world, potentially subjecting these beings to the invasive scrutiny of science or the exploitation of media, he would become a gatekeeper of sorts. The cabin would serve not as his retreat, but as an interface between worlds, an embassy where controlled, respectful contact could occur on terms acceptable to both species. Elaine established a small research collective of trusted colleagues, operating under strict confidentiality protocols. Deputy Whitehorse leveraged his connections with tribal elders to recover traditional knowledge about coexistence practices with the Umar, knowledge deliberately omitted from written records to protect both communities. The existence of the Sasquatch family remained technically unproven to the wider world. No peer-reviewed papers declared their sentience, no viral videos exposed their presence. Yet in the forests of Northern California, a remarkable experiment in interspecies diplomacy unfolded. Daniel's security cameras continued to record, documenting not a cryptozoological curiosity, but the tentative emergence of mutual recognition between two intelligent species that had shared a continent for millennia while existing in parallel dimensions of awareness. 6 months after the initial cabin raid, Daniel sat on his porch at dusk, writing in his journal. Movement at the forest edge drew his attention. Alpha stood watching, now a familiar presence rather than an intrusion. Beside it stood the smaller figures, gradually revealed over time to be adolescents learning about the human neighbor who had become part of their landscape. Daniel raised his hand in the greeting gesture they had established. After a moment's pause, Alpha responded in kind, a simple acknowledgement across an evolutionary gulf that seemed both vast and surprisingly navigable. In that quiet exchange lay the true significance of what had begun as a frightening cabin invasion. The security cameras had indeed caught everything. But what they captured was not a monster's raid, but a first contact scenario played out not in science fiction, but in the ancient forests that still harbored secrets beyond human cataloguing. The footage would remain private, protected, not evidence for scientific validation, but a record of a profound truth. Humanity had never been as alone at the apex of terrestrial intelligence as we had believed. And perhaps, Daniel reflected, as Alpha melted back into the gathering, darkness, that was the most important discovery of all.